Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a seriously fascinating trip back to the 18th century. We are going to discover exactly how two brilliant, completely fearless minds used extreme humor, not just to get a laugh, but as a devastating weapon against oppression and ignorance. We're talking about Jonathan Swift and Voltaire, and how their legacy absolutely changed what it means to be a public intellectual. But first, I want you to picture this. Imagine walking into a prestigious, world-renowned academy and finding a group of highly educated scientists dedicating their entire lives to extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers. Or maybe you sit down for dinner at a royal palace and the servants bring you a shoulder of mutton meticulously cut into a perfect equilateral triangle. It sounds absolutely ridiculous, right? Well, that was exactly the point. These bizarre scenarios were cooked up by Enlightenment satirists to show us just how out of touch and absurd the supposed rational thinkers of their day had actually become. This was exactly how these writers fought back. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our clear roadmap for the explainer. We'll start with the Age of Enlightenment, then look at the weapon of satire, followed by Voltaire attacking optimism, Swift's savage indignation, and finally wrap it up with the humanist intellectual. Section 1. The Age of Enlightenment. Reason and ridicule. So to really understand our satirists, we have to understand their battlefield, the Age of Enlightenment. Flourishing in the 17th and 18th centuries, this was a massive intellectual movement that aggressively questioned traditional views. For centuries, doctrine and custom essentially ruled society. But suddenly thinkers were demanding that human reason and scientific experiment take the wheel. It was a time of immense progress, for sure, but an obsession with cold, hard reason could also lead to its own kind of madness and cruelty. To push back against this, writers turned to satire, a technique using humor, irony, and exaggeration to expose foolishness and corruption. And there are two distinct flavors here. You've got the Horatian mode, which is playfully amusing, it sort of gently nudges you to do better, and then you have the Juvenalian mode. This one is bitter, dark, and utterly outraged. It is literally designed to wound with words. And as you might guess, our two authors wielded this darker Juvenalian style with absolute mastery. Moving on to Section 2, Voltaire's War on Optimism, the battle against toxic positivity. Let's see how this builds with our first case study. Voltaire, born François-Marie Arouet, lived a life of absolute turmoil. He wasn't just sitting quietly in a room writing, he was constantly, aggressively clashing with authority. He rebelled against his family, he mocked the ruling regent of France, and he was repeatedly punished for it. He was a guy who simply could not keep his mouth shut when he saw hypocrisy. Tracing the timeline of his chaotic life, we see that in 1717, he actually gets thrown into the infamous Bastille prison for 11 months. In 1726, he's exiled to England after a quarrel with a powerful aristocrat. But the real turning point, that happens in 1755. An absolutely devastating earthquake strikes Lisbon, killing 50,000 people. And philosophers of the day actually had the nerve to tell the survivors that this was all for the general good. I mean, can you imagine? This callousness deeply incensed Voltaire, fueling an incredible anger that led him to clandestinely publish his masterpiece, Candide, in 1759. With Candide, Voltaire was taking dead aim at optimism as an ideal. Now, this wasn't just about having a sunny disposition. This was a prevailing philosophy championed by thinkers like Gottfried Leibniz, who argued that, since everything was made for a purpose, everything is necessarily for the best purpose. Voltaire found it absurd and deeply offensive that people would use this philosophy to basically rationalize away evil, suffering, and the horrific deaths of 50,000 innocent people in an earthquake. Now, what's really interesting here is how Voltaire systematically dismantled every single pillar of the establishment. For organized religion, he did not hold back, showcasing monks and friars engaging in outright greed and hypocrisy. For politics, he mocked vanity by giving a single governor this endless string of pompous titles. And notice how he deflates class hierarchies using simple, brilliant understatement. He describes the most magnificent castle of a powerful baron, and then casually mentions that its magnificence consisted of having exactly one door and two windows. It's just a brilliant, subtle deflation of aristocratic pride. All right, Section 3, Swift's savage indignation, the shock value of a modest proposal. Let's jump over from France to Ireland. Meet our second warrior, Jonathan Swift. He was an Anglo-Irish writer and a dean in Dublin who used absolute outrage and immense shock value to combat the tyranny of British colonial rule. He actually described his own driving force as savage indignation. His most famous and frankly most disturbing piece of satire is A Modest Proposal, published in 1729. To really get this, you have to understand the grim reality of 18th century Ireland. The British were systematically exploiting the country, reducing the Irish population to a subhuman, impoverished, and literally starving status. People were dying in the streets. But the political discourse of the day was completely detached from this human suffering. Swift realized that a normal, polite political pamphlet just wasn't going to work. He needed to shock the system. And wow, did he shock them! In the proposal, Swift's narrator adopts the voice of a cold, rational Enlightenment economist. He unemotionally calculates the demographics of Ireland, counting wives merely as breeders. By reducing actual human beings to mere statistics, he arrives at a terrifying, perfectly logical solution to poverty. The Irish should sell their infants as food to the rich landlords. By weaponizing this extreme, horrific untruth, eating babies, Swift essentially grabbed his readers by the shoulders and forced them to stare directly at the very real, very horrific moral void in British policies. We also have to briefly touch on his other absolute masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels. Here, Swift wasn't just attacking economic exploitation, he was going after the arrogant pedantry of Enlightenment learning. Remember those scientists trying to extract sunbeams from cucumbers we talked about earlier? That's straight from this book. He exposed how dogmatic English learning had become, pointing out the absolute horror of a society that uses its advanced scientific education not to actually help people, but to invent catastrophic military missiles to sink ships and destroy walls for colonial expansion. Which brings us to Section 4, the humanist intellectual. Bridge in the 18th century to modern theory. So the crucial point is, why does all this 18th century anger matter to us today? Well, we can synthesize these stories using the modern framework of Edward Said, who coined a really important concept called secular criticism. According to Said, the true duty of the humanist intellectual is not to blindly follow party lines or get super comfortable with the establishment. Instead, the intellectual must remain forever skeptical of orthodoxy. They've got to have a critical consciousness that absolutely refuses to be tamed, bought, or guided by state power, nationality, or any special interests. They must speak truth to power and fight against identitarian fanaticism. Said believed that, to achieve this, an intellectual must possess an exilic consciousness. As he beautifully wrote, exile for the intellectual is restlessness, movement, constantly being unsettled and unsettling others. Think about our two satirists for a second. Both of them experienced literal, physical exile, Voltaire to England, Swift to Ireland. But they also lived in a metaphorical exile, constantly positioned on the outside of comfortable society looking in. This deep restlessness and anger is exactly what fueled their creative resistance. And this brilliantly illustrates the nuance when we put them side by side through Said's framework. Swift is generally seen by modern academics as fully oppositional. His satire functions in a humanist way against all forms of hegemonic and national entities. Voltaire, on the other hand, is sometimes viewed as only semi-humanist. While he definitely fought the establishment, some critics argue his ultimate aim still fundamentally consolidated certain European prejudices. But listen, both of them undeniably changed the landscape of critical thought forever. So here is the core takeaway for this entire explainer: the paradox of satire. Both Voltaire and Swift proved that sometimes the direct, polite approach just fails. Sometimes, when a society is completely blind to its own cruelty, the only way to expose a horrific, undeniable reality is to make a brutal, undeniable joke out of it. They told the most profound truths about reality through radically fictional, wildly exaggerated, and shockingly dark means. I want to leave you with this to chew on. We've seen how the 18th century so desperately needed these writers to wake them up. But look around at our present moment. In today's incredibly complex, fast-moving world, who are the modern oppositional intellectuals? Who is out there using that exact same savage indignation to expose our own blind spots today? Keep that question in mind the very next time you hear a joke that cuts just a little too close to the truth. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning everything.